welcome to the UBC Learning Circle hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. Today we have Jeska Slater here from Indigenize talking about support and building networks. First, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people whose lands we're currently on. Also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. I'd like to introduce myself again. My name is Melanie Rivers. I'm from the Squamish Nation. My Statliam name is Mlamowit, and I'm the education coordinator with the UBC Learning Circle. So again, welcome, and welcome, Jeska. I'll just read her bio, and then I'll turn it over to her to do her presentation. So she is a Cree woman whose mother's side of the family is from Fish River Cree Nation in Manitoba. She's been working with Indigenous youth for 8 years. Her work combines traditional teachings and value systems with contemporary art like hip-hop, graffiti, and other unique elements to engage young people. Her training includes Aboriginal child and youth care counseling, trauma-informed practice, and culture as treatment. Jeska wishes to honor her ancestry by highlighting the concept of an intergenerational resilience, or the passing down of gifts, culture, and personal wellness through our bloodlines in order to empower Indigenous youth and families. So, looking forward to the session today.
Great. Okay, so I guess we can get started. So, I'd just like to say Tante to everyone that's there, that's listening, and I just want to really take a moment to acknowledge all the work that you do in community and really hold my hands up to you, everyone joining us. And just wanted to acknowledge how meaningful this work is and how tough it can be too sometimes. So yeah, and this is a picture of in my home territory in our sweetgrass fields. So my mom is from Ochequisipi Cree Nation, otherwise known as Fisher River. We're about 2 hours north of Winnipeg, and I was given my name in this field, and it's Wapske Pasqua Mestosasqueo, which means white buffalo woman. And I was given that name because of our teachings around white buffalo calf woman, who was said to come to human beings at a time of great struggle. And she gave teachings to our people how to live in a good way to ensure the continuity of our culture for the next 7 generations. And my auntie Elsie Crate, who gave me that name, said that because I work with our next generation, that's why I carry that teaching and that lineage and that name. And I've been told we're from the Elk Clan. I'm from the Elk Clan, but our clan system was largely dismantled during colonization, and also our land base we were displaced from our original land base. So we're originally from Norway House, but we're moved a few hundred kilometers south in Manitoba. And I also acknowledge that my dad is English. So, and I also acknowledge that I carry the privilege of being white passing or fair-skinned, and acknowledge that I have a different lived experience than a lot of the folks that I work with and a lot of my family. So I've been working in the field for, that was an old bio, so it's actually 10 years.
Okay.
And work in a lot of different modalities, so really use a lot of art and contemporary art making and music as a vehicle to connect with young people and with communities, and then from there infuse the work with our traditional value systems, cultural resurgence, indigenizing, and really try and create like a confluence between these two paths of connection with where we are at now, and then bringing back in our sacred original law and our land-based law. So this mural, this is up in East Van, and it just says keep the traditions alive, and this was a project that was born from partnerships, so a lot of relationships in this work for sure. I was in a class with Mike D'Angeli at the time. We were he was mentoring many youth on how to do Northwest Coast art, and I felt such a privilege to be included in that as a Cree woman, because it isn't my style of art, but I was there as a connector with the youth and as a volunteer, and this design we created in that class and ended up using in this mural And then I partnered with graffiti artist Take 5, who's a legendary graffiti artist here in Vancouver, who has a great, amazing personal story of resilience and finding strength and connection through art and culture. And then also with another Indigenous artist out of Oakland by the name of Mr. Bouncer or Miguel. So they really help bring this vision to life. And of course using the permission of Mike D'Angeli to use that design that was made in that class. This is another project for a school out in Langley, and so we do incorporate aspects of art like realism and animals, and all of our work is youth-led. So we do a lot of engagement with the youth communities that we're working with to find out what is meaningful to them and how are they expressing this cultural resurgence. And for them it was really based in the animals, and this graffiti here says motivate, and it was a way to talk about how we're motivated to live back in line with our original teachings and live in balance with the land again. And again, that was Take 5 helping us with the project. And this is a slide from my first project. So this is what got me into the work. I was in Montreal working with multi-barriered youth that were street entrenched, were facing pretty abhorrent systemic racism. A lot of them had been displaced from their communities, Inuit and Ainu communities, and found themselves in Montreal, and were really being pathologized. I found a lot of the professionals were really focusing on all these negative things, but so we worked together for a year and really started to unpack their experience, and I wanted to showcase the youth in a proud and positive light and really highlight their strengths and their gifts and what they were bringing to the community. And we did a lot of land-based work, a lot of ceremony, and work with elders, work out on the land in Ganawage. And what emerged from this project was really the inception of the work, in that they really brought to the table their stories and how they viewed working with health professionals, with different people in the community, as sometimes really oppressive. And so I was like, okay, well, how can we change this narrative? How can we shift so that we are honoring these youth and their experience with colonization and looking at the bigger implications of the history, as opposed to just placing that blame and on the individual. So that's really been the focus of the work. And I say intergenerational resilience, but it's really coupled with that notion that we need to unpack what's happened to our families over the last 400 years, and that we shouldn't have to be resilient, but we are. And so, we do have that ancestral line in us still that we can tap into, and really so working at what that looks like, because now that there has been so much displacement and there's so many people living off their territories in urban centers, and then we're living on the nations of other folks too. So how can we do this in a good way where we're respecting our lines but also respecting the lines and the land of where we reside? So for my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about relationships and networks in the context of Cree Sacred Law. I am a student. I am not an expert, but really coming at this from my personal experience with indigenizing our family and creating networks of support, and then also working with Indigenize. So right now I'm tasked with forming a social enterprise with youth in and from foster care, Indigenous youth. And Indigenize has partnered with us to do all of our training, but it's been a lot of self-actualization for the staff as well. So I just love their model. I'm behind the model. I'm behind the land-based and artistic modalities that they use, and so I'm really honored that they asked me to come present today. And so we'll talk about relationship and network on a number of different levels, and at the end of the presentation I'll show you why that is, that interconnectedness and the circular frameworks that actually come from the land-based law of where I'm from. So I'm going to start with the self, and this is a mural that was done by Orlast and Chief Ladybird, Nancy King, and I just really love this mural. I really love their work, and I always try and show work from Indigenous artists whenever we facilitate workshops and connect to how people are bringing the culture into the future. So I really love one thing that Mike D'Angeli said in that class was, nobody has the right to delineate, quantify, or qualify our ancestral gifts. And what he meant by that was, to call our work traditional puts us in the past tense, whereas we're living and breathing and being today. And yes, we do need to honor the protocols and the systems that were in place by our ancestors, but we are also evolving the expression of how we work with culture in this day-to-day living in a Western, society, and like what that looks like. So as Indigenous people, we are always very adaptable, and I feel like that is an incredible strength given what our families and selves have been through over the last 400 years and what that looks like as we move into the future. So I just came from a training called The Art of Hosting with Chris Corrigan and his wife, and the Circle put that on, and it was all about hosting others. So how can we host others? But one thing that I really loved what they said was, how can we host ourselves first?
Mm-hmm.
So
it starts there.
Yeah, it starts there. So this is our first slide, is hosting ourselves and being well and in relationship with ourselves, and being rooted in ourselves and in our own connection to the land and to our teachings and our own responsibilities that come along with that. So one thing that I really was drawn to about learning about our sacred law was the idea of accountability, because I wasn't seeing a lot of accountability in our communities or in our workplaces, or in that really traditional context of what that means. So for me, personal accountability is how am I hosting myself? How am I working on my own triggers? How am I working on my own stuff so I can really show up and be present in the work and really bring 100% of myself there? And what kind of gets me off the path? Like, what are the things that pull me off from being present and from being healthy in myself? So I've been doing a lot of different kinds of work, but it's a never-ending process. I don't see it ending. It is a journey, and as we're trying to stop the transmission of intergenerational harm and trauma, it is a lot of work in ourselves, and it is a lot of work in our bodies. And so for me, connecting home, with my family, with my siblings, with the people that are involved in more traditional ways of knowing, it's been a really huge blessing to be able to come home into that and to have that the teachings that were associated with that. So for me, our teachings are, you can't use any substance and then practice our traditional medicine. So I had to make that choice to abstain from drinking and using substance. So that happened for me actually in Montreal during that first project. So, and it was a real personal journey, because I was working with these young people, and everyone's saying to them, all these professionals, you shouldn't be drinking, you shouldn't be doing drugs, you shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And I was like, I didn't really feel in my heart like that was the right way of going about it, because I could see it as a coping mechanism, and I could see it as a way of numbing real pain, real stuff that was happening for these young people. And I was also drinking and out, in the art scene and partying around, and so it felt like inauthentic for me to be saying that, or to be trying to foster that with the young people I was working with, and not doing it myself. So that's a personal choice of mine, and I really am not judgmental about other people's personal choices, and I say that to young people too. I'm not going to judge you of where you're at right now, with what you're going through, with how you're managing what you're going through, but then just trying to also model how my family and my friends and or the community have come together to know a healthy way of being in ourselves. Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to really reiterate that it starts there. It starts with ourselves, and to be doing our work as professionals, to know our triggers and to know, to go through our own trauma work to be able to show up for others. And I work with an incredible counselor. She's got a PhD, she's an Anishinaabe, and she just said to me in our last session, you know, you're only going to take people as far as you can go, or as far as you've gone. And I see that in our communities too with professionals. Like, we have a great vision for our people and our communities, but we also have to be doing the work and being authentic and showing up that way. So the next part of our circle is our families, which is probably the hardest one sometimes.
The most triggers.
Yeah, the most triggers, but also the biggest gifts in terms of teachers too. And I look at my family like they're all teaching me.
So many teachers.
And my babies too, right? My little ones, they're teaching me too every day about how we are really breaking that transmission, you know, of what happened in residential school, and about loving our children in a good way. And so that's really been a really big part of our work, is looking at how we can pass down those value systems of raising our children well. And and my family, we had a lot of experience, a lot of history with institutionalization, and on my dad's side too. So my dad was in an orphanage for a time, and my mom, intergenerational survivors of residential school. So it was really interesting growing up. There wasn't a lot of like outward love, or like I love you, or that stuff. But it was still it was a safe place to be, but it was very like structured, and so we've really been doing a lot of work about showing love and showing up for each other and in love and being loving to my children, and it's really been a blessing to be able to share with my family some of our ceremonial journey. My mom was actually the one to get me back into those ways. So I moved back home after being in Montreal, not really knowing how to connect with cultural supports, and my mom and I are really on this journey together, so it's been really interesting. And she's probably my biggest cheerleader and champion, and so I just want to give a little shout out to Mom. So in the work, in the child and youth care counseling work, they talked a lot about how looking at our family constellations is really necessary to be able to look at the history and how we're being impacted with ourselves and our work, but also how our families have been impacted too with colonization, and that work was really triggering for sure. Like, that was probably some of the toughest work I've ever done, but again, I feel like that allows us to show up better. When we go through our triggers, we're not going to be triggered in the work. So relationship to family, really working with other people to look at what that system looks like and why it looks like that. So there's a number of different modalities that do work with family systems, and I really am a big believer in them. So family constellation work, there's a number of other different folks that are doing it in more of an Indigenous way now, which is really cool to see. But definitely when we're working with clients, looking at the family history, I think has been quite impactful. Also unpacking, what systems have been broken in the family too, and looking at modes of how we can start to repair some of those systems. And that's not always possible, right? It's not always possible, and for young people, it's coming to a place of acknowledging that too, as part of the grieving and the healing work. Like, it's not always going to be peachy after what's gone on, and just to come to a place of like deep acknowledgement and healing and moving on from that place, I think can be really powerful. And a lot of what we're talking about today has come from the youth. Like, this is what I'm hearing from young people who've been raised in the system too. And I just want to acknowledge too the wisdom and the gifts that young people hold. I think are going to provide us with a lot of solutions, you know, and so moving back into a more Indigenous way of knowing and being, a more circular way that acknowledges the gifts of each individual is going to really help us and move out of this pyramidal power structure, you know, these Western modes of thinking, and really honoring our individuals for having the wisdom that they in themselves to know how to move forward. And this is another mural. This is out of South America. So this collective, they do a lot. They go into Indigenous community and they work with different families, different organizations. And I just love this piece because it's like how we connect to each other. And then the land is in there too, right? So the roots that really hold us together. And so looking at the relationships with our families, and definitely still a student, definitely still working, and learning what that looks like too as a mixed blood woman, I think has been a really interesting journey. So I definitely align more with the Indigenous law, Indigenous land-based learnings, just because that's what makes sense to me, but acknowledge that, you know, my family, half of it was colonized too a long time ago, right? And I've heard from some Indigenous scholars and activists that settlers, like the settler part of my family, we actually have more work to do because it was a longer time ago that colonization happened. And Chris Archie at the Circle in that last workshop was just saying, you know, we've all been displaced from our land, from our original places, and our Indigenous law states that that's where our teachings come from. So whatever we were born into, we listen to the teachings of that land. And when we've been displaced from that land, there's a lot of pain that comes along with it, and it makes us act in real funny ways, right? So I really connected when Chris said that. I said, you know, I was like, wow, this isn't just for Indigenous people, it's for all people. But through our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, we can kind of connect back to really deep places in our work and working with others too, and recognizing that this is a journey not just for Indigenous people, but for all of us to decolonize and to examine the way that those systems are working on our families, and then also how complicit we are in those systems. So so that's for me, like, really been a lot about the work and about relating to people, relating to family, and acknowledging where we're at and just going from there. So next in the spectrum here we have our community. So I really love the work of Dr. Jan Derrick, and she has this really powerful teaching called The Circle in the Box, and I recommend everyone to take it. I put my youth through it. I've done it. It's very healing. I've seen it be transformative with community, with non-Indigenous folks and Indigenous folks, because I think when we unpack the systems, and she makes you act it out. So it's like really real. And I've seen the most transformative effects happen when you act it out. And it's the same with Indigenized. So when we are coming back home into our bodies, you know, oftentimes we're really cut off. You know, academia is really up here. You know, it's not really down here. So it's a real journey to come back into our bodies. And I think for the Indigenous folks we work with too, because trauma, we know, has implications in the way that we are in our bodies and the way that we hold trauma in our physical selves too. So a lot of that really powerful community work I've seen is with facilitators doing experiential, art-based, land-based learning. Like really huge transformations. And I was at a land-based camp with Kimi King of Indigenized last year at Glimpse Lake, and we had 2 youth from foster care that were actually from the territory, and they were going home right, after being taken out of their territory. And one of them had selective mutism, so I never really heard him speak ever. The whole time working with them. His sister, we spoke, it's great. And so we brought them up to the camp, and immediately you could see something happen, like a sinking in or like a landing. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. So we were going through the camp, and these siblings, they would stay up all night. And usually people in these camps being like, oh, we have curfew and we have this and that. And the facilitators just let them be, just said, okay, so that's what you're going to do, that's all right. And the elders came one day and they said, that's actually something our people would do, is they would watch out at the camp. They would be the watchmen, and they would sit out all night at the fire, be our fire keepers, and really hold space. And
give them a sense of purpose.
Yeah, totally. And the role, like those traditional roles, after being so displaced, like, not just from the land, but also from culture, from their family, like, so they really honored them for that. And then there was a lot of scaffolding that happened throughout the weekend. So there was a puppet show, and then all of a sudden this young boy is doing the voices of the puppets. And we're like, wow, who's that? Like, and we were just witnessing this transformation happening. And then at the last day of the camp, he gave a speech to everyone and just talked about what it was like being that watchman and what he saw. And he had the whole camp in tears. Like, it was so powerful. So I'm seeing really transformative things happen for our young people when we can connect in a good way to the land and to our teachers and to elders. So that was just one little story with Indigenize. This is some of the young people we work with in Surrey. These photos are done by Kelsey Marchand of Seal Images, and she's just been a huge champion of our work too, and documenting young people in their light too, and really helping them to shine in the culture. And so as far as relationship building goes in the work in community, I think it's really about aligning with those folks too that are gonna that are really in alignment with your values, as far as helping to bring out the gifts of people. So that for me has been really transformative. So finding Indigenize, finding Kelsey, finding these mentors, different doctors and scholars that will really support the work. And I think when you're talking about building support networks for other workers, that can be really powerful. So who do you align with, like in your organization? Who do you align with in other organizations? Who wants to fan your flame? Who wants to see you like shine and grow? And so for me, on a professional level, that's been really amazing and important. And Kimmy King at Indigenize calls it lateral liberation. So, we all know the effects of lateral violence and the effects of colonization that way, but who is helping you to liberate laterally, and who's helping you to, really bring out your best work? And then not only that, but how can you help people to liberate, on that lateral level? So again, coming back to being aware of our triggers, being aware of how we work with folks. So that's been a huge strategy for me in terms of how I show up professionally. And still, lots of lessons and stuff to go through, tough stuff to go through. But growth is never comfortable, right? So
we
just keeping that in mind, like in the back burner all the time, that like when we're uncomfortable, when it really sucks, just really honor yourself and honor why that is, and look at it as a place to grow. Like, this is an opportunity for growth and to liberate my peers and really name how colonization is affecting our relationships in a working environment, and unpacking those things I find is really helpful, right? So on all levels. Also connecting intergenerationally. So I just heard of a housing project that went up in Kamloops that's going to be for elders and youth. And I just thought, wow, that's like the most amazing housing project I've ever heard of. Like, that's really, I think, the way forward, not only for our youth, but for our elders too, right? Because when elders become displaced, when they're put into a home, and that sense of purpose is lost too, right? That sense, that role. So really, I see the best way of supporting networks and relationships are coming back into our roles, looking at what our roles were pre-contact in regards to our sacred law, and how we can kind of get back to those spaces and places now in an urbanized or, contemporary way. And so I love to see elders really being honored for their experience and what they've been through. A lot of elders have been displaced from that culture and the traditional knowledge too, but it's amazing to see the transformative effects of what can happen when we're put back into that role. And I was just up in the Kootenays this weekend, and I heard of a ceremony happening in Manitoba, a Sundance ceremony that's just for women, that's for the missing and murdered women. And I was like, wow, that is so powerful, a Sundance, that's just women. But the men come too, and they help, but they're all from the prison. They're all from the penitentiary. And this woman was talking about how amazing it's been to witness these young men want to make things right, and want to do that work. So they're digging like outhouse ditches and building stuff and really learning about how they can support now that work. Because they, a lot of the times have been traumatized too, or men have been traumatized and have implicated themselves in these situations, and they want to make it right too, right? So I think really looking at how we can support folks, especially Indigenous folks, to make that right within themselves and to empower them to come back to that role, that really empowered role. And again, referring back to the work of Jan Derrick, she puts us in a formation about what happens, like what the Western worldview was at the time of contact. And it's a pyramid, and you're sitting in that pyramid. It's like you have the Pope, the men, the women, and the children are way at the back. And she asks you, how do you feel? And it's like, I feel really uncomfortable. Like, I feel insecure. And she says this is where a lot of lateral violence comes from, because when the heat comes down on you, you just want to push it off to your peer, right? And but I think for men, even though they have maybe some power in this patriarchal system, it's also a place of insecurity too. And it's not a good feeling to be in. And there's, I was just listening to a webinar this morning about how when we hold privilege, there is a certain amount of guilt that comes along with that. Whether we are totally woke and trying to really work on it, we still have to look at that, and especially for me, that's why I acknowledge that I'm fair-skinned, because that does give me a different experience. And I've been listening to more and more men say, this gives me a different experience, but also how am I upholding this structure, because I'm uncomfortable and I'm scared too, right? And so I think in all of this work, whether it's in the self, the family, or the community, what's going to really propel us is looking at how colonization has affected those systems. And when we are in this pyramidal power structure, it affects all people, not just the ones on the bottom, but the ones on the top too. And it's not nice for anyone.
No.
And then community. So looking at community, again, like I said, I work in Surrey, so I work at the Fraser Region Aboriginal Friendship Centre, and we have people from all nations, from all over, a lot of Plains people, a lot of people that have been displaced, but we're also on the territory of someone. So this is a really interesting confluence that's happening right now in our urban centers. And so we're on the traditional territory of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, Kakite, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, and Tsawwassen First Nations. So there's a real big intersection there of different nations, and it's been a huge learning experience of how to engage respectfully with the nations when doing this work. And a lot of the time, what I've learned is that the nations don't always have the resources to answer every protocol request. Mm-hmm. So this is a really interesting place to be in the work. It's like we want to honor the nations. We want to acknowledge that we're settlers here too, in your territory that has never been ceded, that has never been surrendered. And but there's a lot of implications that come along with that too, and a lot of experiences that the nations have had that we need to look at, and we need to honor, and we need to acknowledge where we're at right now in that relationship. And we're really lucky. We work closely with Kwantlen First Nation, so they've hosted all of our youth honoring ceremonies, our rites of passage, and we honor their protocol when we're there because we're on their land. But we also acknowledge it as a doorway home for especially these people in urban centers. So we say, we're going to do this way because we're on their territory. We need to go through that. But the way that Kwantlen elders and the nation has prayed for these young people is that, I hope you find your way home too. And I hope that you're going to connect with your own laws and your own teachings of your land. And so I think that's just really beautiful. And I really love that as a way of kind of navigating how we work in urban centers and with different nations. This is a picture of my sisters. So community again, finding communities. So, a lot of our folks, a lot of our family aren't blood relatives now, and we've had to really build up our networks again from a place of individualization, from a place of separation. And I think that a lot of the separation that happened is intentional because it keeps us in a really low place, right? Like, I have a son. I was like, well, I could go and live on my own and be a single mom and raise him on my own, but that just makes no sense to me. Like, I need my family. I need the aunties. I need my mom. I need all the help I can get to raise this little guy up. And so for me, it's been about really finding community too and seeking it out, and who are the people around me that are healthy or that want to be healthy, and especially between women too. So a lot of our ceremonies now are mixed, but where I come from originally, it was just women that would be together, and we had our own secret societies. We had our own ways of being together. We had ways of mentorship and knowledge transmission that I really had to mourn, in my younger years, because I knew something was missing. I knew when I was a teenager, this isn't how it's supposed to be. Like, I was just suffering, and I didn't know I was grieving that. I was calling out for that. I wanted that mentorship. I wanted someone to see me and to see the gifts I was carrying and help me bring them out. And so when we're working in community, I think for me, some of the most important parts of the work are reinstating those mentorship structures in any way that we can, to really try and bring our young people up in a good way, bring our kids up in a good way, where they're going to be seen and loved and honored and cherished. And so I do a lot of research around rites of passage, and over the years I've come to learn that not having a rites of passage ceremony is probably the most detrimental thing that we could be doing. And our society, our Western society, is the only place that doesn't have it, right? So like all other nations, all other societies, all other religions have it, right? Except for where we are right now. And I was like, oh, it's really interesting. And some of the research was saying that this is why we see our young people piercing themselves and dyeing their hair. They're trying to ritualize, like bring that ritual to themselves and have a marker.
Identity.
Yeah, that they're moving away from their parents' identity now. You're not in your parents' identity anymore. And I think how it would happen in our nations, pre-contact where I'm from, is that you would have to go out on the land. So you would be put out on the land for 4 days, and in the psychology too, they call it a crisis and a commitment. So that all rites of passage share this common thread that you have to go through something real tough, and then you re-emerge as your adult self. And so you would have the whole community really band around you and celebrate you and give you your spiritual name and say, you know, we've been watching you your whole life and we see these gifts in you. And we want to help you bring out these gifts, and we're going to pair you up with this expert in that gift, you know, and then, you know, that there's your 10,000 hours, you know, you're becoming an expert in your gift. And so just wondering how we can weave back in these mentorship structures. So, in terms of community, aligning with organizations that also see the need for that has been really helpful. I've written grants so I can hire my mentor. Like I really try and get that mentorship, and so my mentor is Dr. Cynthia Sturbies, and she has written a framework about women healing from intergenerational trauma through residential school, and so there's scholars, like there's people doing this work that's actually really traditional, but in our ways now. So I love that intersection of academia and traditional knowledge.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Oh, no.
It's a video conference.
Oh, okay, good. So I'm really passionate about that, and I'm really passionate about how we're going to bring up our young people and finding good, healthy ways of bringing up our young people. And for me, that's been going back to ceremony. I know not every nation has access to that anymore or has the resources. So for me, it's really basic. It's eating food together and singing together or dancing together. Like it can be really basic. And I heard of a youth program. They wanted to honor their elders, so they had a Valentine's Day dance for their elders, and they brought in an old tiny band, or I can't remember who it was, these, you know, the old musicians, like playing these old songs, and then they served their elders, and they just had a community feast for their elders, and I just thought that was so beautiful, to see how we can help support different activities in our communities that really bring some of this stuff back.
And I've seen too that what you're talking about, the self, so that the adults also need to take care of that self around the coming of age, and because if they haven't experienced and had that for themselves, then they may not be in the place to support.
No,
so
totally.
They have their own ways of going through ceremony. And
I love that. I love that you brought that up, because I think I had mine when I was 32 because I needed it. I needed to do it. It never been done. And I was really lucky. This is down in Arizona in Roan Horse Canyon, so we linked up with some elders up here actually, and were brought down there and did a lot of learning with them. So that was really interesting. My family was like, "What are you doing? Why are you working with all these Navajo people? You know, you're Cree." And I was like, "Well, this is what I'm being called to do." And they had teachings too about, you know, we do this, but it's for you to go home too, right? So there's a lot of other implications too, like when you're working with different ceremonies, I think, and different ways of being and knowing. And I know a lot of people out here in the BC now practice Plains style ceremonies, but I look at it that way because Plains people, we have, you know, there's a Cree behind every tree. There's so many of us. Our language, you know, isn't at as much of a risk of becoming extinct. Our ceremonies aren't as much of a risk of becoming extinct. And there has been a really conducive transmission, I think, just because of the numbers and how big our population is. So, you know, I see a lot of resistance sometimes. Well, it's not our ways, and I get that, and I think that it's totally understandable to think that. But I also think that we can work with people that have been really connected with their sacred law and look at it as a doorway home, because a lot of knowledge transmission comes through interacting with those deep ways of knowing. And I've seen people remember songs and of their own people, you know, and so just it's been really incredible, and navigating how we have to work now in this society that we've been so displaced, and there has been so much of a cut, you know, how can we bring back these things? So it's becoming almost this globalized society in the Indigenous world too, right? And then, but it's also has the value of bringing back our own stuff and our own ways and our own connection to the land. And I really see that as a way of Indigenous people supporting each other too, right? And it's we're all on this journey of like unpacking this stuff and healing and dealing and resurgence. And then, you know, there's ways we can support each other. So I just want to give a little shout out to my sisters out there. And you know, it's really beneficial for me in my practice too to have that supportive community, because it's hard sometimes and we hear hard stuff, and so I need that. I need my sisters, and we really support each other in the work, and we are sounding boards, we debrief, you know, it's been really healing to reinstate some of those women's circles. Yeah. And I've seen some really amazing men's circles too. So you know, we were just out in, I don't want to butcher the name, Tla'auquehuet, out in Tofino. Yeah. And they have just started a men's group out there, and wow, it's so powerful. I'm just like, you want to support your nation, your community, start a men's group, start a women's group, just start, you know, doing art or whatever it is, you know, that you want to do, get out into the land, and because that's how we were. I think that's how it worked pre-contact, and that individualization, I think, is is the root of a lot of the issues, right? So reconnecting to each other, and yeah, that's a really hard thing to do too sometimes, you know, because there is a lot of stuff there.
Fear of that connection as well.
For sure. And I just went to a ceremony up in the Kootenays, and it was put on by a young man. He was only 18, and he did all the work. Wow. And he brought all his young people that he knew that had never had this experience or been around ceremony, and he said, I wanted to share this with you because it's the most beautiful part of my life. And the way he was talking to these young men, he was like, you know, I really love you. To these young men, I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, there's hope for the future. If I can raise my son up like this, and we're going to be all right. But just to see that honesty and that vulnerability in our young people, and how they're bringing back our ways too, and is really giving me a lot of hope. So with that, it's funny, it's not bringing up the words, but our sacred responsibility, this is supposed to say. So yeah, we work with a lot of street art too, and I really love working within street art as a framework to say, you know, about resistance. And like, street art has been used for a long time for resistance, and as a way to symbolize our struggle with what we've been through with colonization, with the land displacement, things like that. And it's a really great way to connect with young people, so they can really align with the messages a lot of the time. But I think on a nation level, again, we're looking at, in our laws, there's really explicit ways that map out what our sacred responsibility is, not only to ourselves, not only to our family, our community, but our nation. And this responsibility is really what I see as the most powerful way of working in community, because it brings back structures of accountability that have been dismantled through colonization, particularly around women and children. So when I was out on the coast, I can't remember this elder's name, but he said something. He was a carver, canoe carver out there, and he said something so powerful to me. He said to this group, he said, you know, in our sacred law, it was any infraction, any way that we moved away from our sacred law was dealt with very swiftly. It was like quick. And abuse against women and children were probably the biggest crimes you could commit, because the children were the center of our society, and the women were tasked with caring them and also bringing them here. So all life comes through a woman, so it was so sacred, those roles of the women and children, and to hurt them were one of the biggest crimes. And he said, you know, if you get a sliver, do you leave it in there? You get something in your eye, do you leave it in there? Nope. You deal with it quick, because you don't want it to grow into something else. And that just really hit home for me, and I thought, wow, that was our accountability structure. And it was really based in the knowledge too that of how sacred our women are and how sacred our children are. So for me, that's the most powerful way of cultural resurgence, is bringing back those teachings. And in light of the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, wow, really in line, right? And also looking at how patriarchy and colonization has made its way into our traditional societies too, right? So that was a big part of my healing, was understanding that that's made its way into our homes too, and that we have to unpack that stuff too and say, okay, yes, I can see, and I know it happens with everyone, but I could see men upholding these unhealthy structures in our ceremonial communities and like kind of treating women like we're teaching you, or and it was really hard for me. And once I understood the impacts of colonization even in our own families and communities, it really helped me to understand what is a systemic thing that's going on here. But again, with those men that were doing not so cool stuff to women, in our traditional communities, they were really hurt too, and they were really insecure in that position, and they were upholding the power that they got from the patriarchal system, but they didn't like it either, right? So that accountability piece, that sacred responsibility piece, in our communities, I think it was the men that held the men accountable, and it was the women that held the women accountable. So when I was being talked to like this from my brothers, I was like, I don't think that's right. I think my grandmas or my aunties are the ones that should be addressing that stuff with us. And the same with you guys. Like, it shouldn't be our job to be like, that's not cool. It's like the other men's job to do that, right? So yeah, that's been a really tough part of the work and a really huge piece of the journey, but definitely been learning a lot. And again, the intersection of the academia with the cultural has been helpful, right? Because there's a lot of stuff coming up through the research right now. So we have one of my favorite scholars, Macoxis, and I just love this quote from her master's thesis. This is why our elders tell us, go to ceremony and learn the ways of the old people. It is ceremonies that begin to strip away the layers of colonialism that keep us bound to a colonized existence. Elders teach us that if we can only begin to understand what it really means to be in the Nehea, if we live in ceremony, through ceremony, we learn what our role and responsibility is to our people. And it is this role that keeps our relationship accountable and on the path of living the good life, Mio Pimatawin. Sorry, it's a little cut off there. So, yeah, that really just sums up the work to me. And Nehea is a Cree word for people, and what that means is a four-bodied person. So, or the people of the four directions. But I've heard it being taught that Neha means four, so it's like our mental, spiritual, physical, and emotional selves. And we have within that four bodies that responsibility to ourselves and to the way that we move through the world. And one of the ways that we can decolonize or indigenize is to go back to our teachers and our original laws. And another quote from her is, through ceremony that Nehewak learn how to organize and live life by the traditional roles and responsibilities our ancestors formed and gave us in hopes that we would protect, keep, and live authentic Nehea ways of life. And I think that really speaks to the children, like maintaining our world and our ways for our children and those next 7 generations, and going back to those protocols, that they're there for a reason. And our ancestors, our laws are from the land, and our laws are from spirit, and they're that way for a reason. And when we can come home into them and live in line into them, then we're carrying out our work in a good way, like our purpose in a good way. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But it's been a really interesting journey in how we can reinstate these original ways of knowing and being in the Western world. And I really love the work of Sogage Ward. He's an activist. He does a lot of land-based teachings, but he goes and he reinstates men's warrior societies. And I think that's really powerful, because it's, again, allowing folks to come back into their roles and to see like how we keep each other accountable, and also how we can protect our way of life and our next seven generations going forward. So this is, on a nation level, this is a mural that the youth did in Surrey. And so Surrey just has a huge influx of population coming in from Vancouver. I think we're stated to have 16,000 Indigenous folks out there now, with a median age of 26.2.
Wow.
Super young population, and not a lot of like really strong community gathering places. So I think that's the work that's really trying to happen there right now with the Fraser Region Friendship Centers, and they have Indigenous Leadership Council with the city that's doing incredible research and work. So we painted 3 young people that were being recognized by the community as leaders. Hector on top there, with the hat on, he had a really big struggle living in foster care and going through so many different homes. And working with him was really incredible, because he was a living embodiment of coming back into your culture from incredible displacement and incredible, being involved in the system. So like, and now he's gone home to his community up north. But just really inspiring young folks, and we really just wanted to tell a story with this image. So it's 16 of these florals to symbolize 1,000 Indigenous people in Surrey, and then the eagle represents our original teachings of that land, and it's a juvenile golden eagle. So it's also recognizing the gifts of our young people and the teachings that our young people are bringing back. And so that aligns with the teaching that, our children, they're really close to Creator. When they come here, they're really close, and the same with our young people. They still have a lot of connection and gifts and wisdom that they're bringing back with them into our communities, and it's time that we need to honor that and highlight that. And then also with the, what we see in the media about Indigenous folks or Indigenous young people oftentimes is really negative, or, just talking about the crisis after crisis, and it's like they're actually doing amazing stuff too.
Sure, there's
and
good stories.
Yeah, and we have Indigenous folks becoming doctors and lawyers and looking at Indigenous law, and so these were all the young people there that were in the painting. Actually, this was unveiling the mural last year, and we were giving gifts to all the nations to say thank you for allowing us to do this work and to live and to exist on your unceded territory. And it was definitely a learning journey to get to this place. There was some resistance, there was some like hurdles, like it was tough, right? And but this to me speaks of a moment of victory of the land-based nations and these urbanized youth coming together and for a common purpose, for a common good, and now we're really building that relationship, and the youth are going onto the reserve, and they want to help out with their community functions this summer, and they want to give back and say thank you. So I think that's another way that we can foster healthy networks and community, is ask ourselves in our work, how can we tangibly support the nations? Not just give it acknowledgement, but how can our work actively support these nations as they re-indigenize and research in their own culture, and not just give lip service, but with our actions. So I'm really proud of these young people for wanting to do that and seeing the importance of that. And it's scary, going into these communities, and they're just really trying. So I just think that's a really important part of the work as well. Okay, so the last slide, the last section here is spirit. And like I said, with my teachings, it's all of our laws and teachings come from spirit and come from the land. And Sylvia McAdams has some really beautiful teachings online that you can access, but she was talking about how when human beings come here, they go through Creator's fire, and it's at that point that it's decided where you're going to be born, and if you'll be male or female, or how you'll identify. And she said that when we're born, part of our worldview states that you follow the laws of the land of where you were born. And so it's not, my way or the highway in our worldview. It's that your beliefs are going to be diverse depending on where you live and the teachings from the land. And we hear that in the songs. We hear that in the ceremonies. Like where I'm from, we're horse people and our songs are really fast. And then you go out to, the coast here in these deep valleys and the songs are so slow. And it's like, it really sounds like it comes from the territory, from the land. And so when I was doing research on our worldview, I was so happy to hear that because I do think that all of our nations have really beautiful ways of organizing themselves and connecting to their original teachings, and we can go back there. Like we can connect to those things, and there's ways to help with that cultural resurgence, and I really just hold my hands up to all the folks doing that work right now, because how beautiful is that for our people? How beautiful is that going to be for our children? And I think that's really the way that we're going to see big healing and big transformation happen. And it's not always supported, in our Western ways of knowing and being, and there is a lot of tension, but that's the part of the resurgence or the intergeneral resilience piece, is that we're strong and we came through such a huge fire, and we're still like, wow, have such beautiful gifts and knowledge in our families and in our lives. So this model here is from, I really love Dr. Laboucaine Benson's work, and this shows Cree worldview and how our worldview is connected. So if you look at the accountability models, we're accountable as an individual, we're accountable to family, community, nation, natural environment, and the cosmos. So we are always connected to spirit. We're never disconnected, and that is through the accountability structure. And I love this. I love this model because it shows like how we relate to each other, and we also relate to the laws, and we relate to our teachings and what our responsibilities are as an individual. And we are in this circular framework. And I'm just finishing a Bachelor of Leadership right now, and we were looking at all these different worldviews, and that was something that came up for me because half of my family is religious, half my family is like doing our traditional stuff, and I never like to say it's like one way or the other, but that was something that really came up for me, was the idea of being abolished, like forgiven, or like our deeds being abolished, so like we don't have that. Like you have to be accountable. Right. There's really fundamental ways that we have to be accountable when we make a mistake. And we can't just ask for forgiveness and then go and try not to do it again, because that's part of the learning. And I think that, when they talk about that thing in your eye or that sliver, when we can just say, okay, say this and you're going to be forgiven, that can cause some problems, and that can cause this issue to fester. And I think that is an analogy for how much we do see a lot of the abuse in our communities. So moving back to sort of accountability structure like this makes a lot of sense to me. And whether we can do that in our organizations, through policy, our band administrations, through policy, like there's real ways that we can make this happen and model it for the young people. So my sister does this kind of work. She'll go into an organization and really analyze it and think, okay, so what's the issue here? And then build a training, build a policy around that. And it's transformative work. And, seeing people come out of that and have to deal with, okay, there's lateral violence, but what's at the core of it? Where does it come from? Unpacking that stuff, putting that stuff in your policy too. And yeah, so accountability structures, I really appreciate the traditional knowledge about them. And then Dr. Laboucaine Benson also refers to this as a way, so I'm just going to bring up my notes here. I just wanted to read this one piece. So let me just bring my... Okay, so that first spiral that you saw, this is from her paper on policy within judicial institutions. It illustrated the interconnected worldview that was supported by Cree teachings of Wekotwin. So Wekotwin is our natural law. And when you break Wekotwin, it's called Pastahwin. And that's what was dealt with very swiftly. And so when Cree people were prevented from teaching these values, rules, and way of life, the scaffolding that ensured healthy, respectful relationships was severely damaged, and the spiral collapsed in on itself. And the critical relational boundaries were transgressed. The spiral for some families and community has become tangled, chaotic knot. The intergenerational effect of colonial policies is a pervasive sense of hopelessness, helplessness, powerlessness, and as a result, Aboriginal people remain overrepresented in child welfare, justice, and correctional systems in Canada. And I was just like, wow, that is so illuminating. It's so true. We have to look at how the colonial policies have and still continue to have an effect on our communities and our way of life. And so I think being able to unpack that for our communities and our networks is going to be a really powerful way. And it's happening. That work is happening. And it's happening with our young people too. But I think that's going to be a really powerful way to work within community. And then also referring back to Dr. Jan Derrick's work, when she puts Indigenous folks through that model of our Indigenous communities, how it once functioned, and then puts them through the model of the Western worldview and how it functions, it turns a light on folks. It turned a light on me about how colonial policy has affected my family and has affected our communities. So I think when we can have those deep realizations as Indigenous folks, as non-Indigenous folks, we're going to be doing really powerful work from those places. So really recommending bringing in those processes to your practices, bringing in those processes for your peers. You know, if you're an Indigenous folk working in a non-Indigenous organization, that can be really hard too. So advocating for these cultural safety, cultural competency frameworks that are going to really turn those lights on. Because we know that there's still that discrepancy in the way that our folks access health care, are overrepresented in the judicial system, and then looking at, there's policy out there that helps make that happen. You know, like, and then analyzing how the policy within our institutions and organizations can be shifted to make access to healthcare and these services more, you know, in line for our folks, right? And yeah, so the work of the child and youth care advocate, Bernard Richard, really sad to hear that he's stepping down, you know, uncovered Directive 20-1 that proves that the federal government incentivizes every time an Indigenous child is apprehended from the home, so gives money to the provinces, and this stuff is still happening. This is today. Like, this is not something that can just be passed over. Like, we need to critically analyze that these structures are still in place and they're still causing harm. And when we're working with Indigenous folks, they're carrying that too. And that we have to acknowledge that. And, you know, that policy was introduced in the 60s, and it went from 3% of all kids in care were Indigenous to 60% here in Canada. So that's a huge jump with that policy. We've seen Manitoba is now pulled out of that policy because their child welfare sees 90% of their kids are Indigenous. So, like, wow, there's still a lot of stuff to examine. There's a lot of stuff to work through, and I think that, you know, Tapwewin in Cree worldview, that means truth-telling, or like, that's one of our core values is truth. We need to start working from that truth and just look critically, what is the situation right now? It's big. It's this tangled mess. How can we start to untangle this spiral and make it healthy again? And this is one of the ways that Dr. Laboucaine Benson recognizes a way of untangling that spiral in our own communities is reconciliation for our essential relationships. So I know, and this is all from Cree worldview too, but reconciliation, we call it the R word sometimes because it's still really hard for our people to hear. And why is that resistance there? Okay, because we haven't been able to reconcile with ourselves. Like in order for reconciliation to happen with non-Indigenous folks, we need to be given that time and space to rebuild, and not just with our own nations, but with other Indigenous folks too, because there's so much divide and conquer still happening, with these land-based processes, and so she's talking about reconciliation between each other, which is, I think, so necessary, and talking about that lateral liberation. How can we support each other instead of keeping to hold each other down and not allowing each other to shine and use those gifts that Creator gave us? The other piece there is reclaiming our interconnected worldview, our Wakotuin, our sacred law. We all have sacred law. Even non-Indigenous folks, thousands of years ago, you have sacred law too. That's there still. We have it all. It's embedded in our DNA. They've talked about epigenetics, how this stuff travels through our bloodline. In our teachings, we also talk about that. We are born into these nations for a reason, and we connect to these ways and teachings for a reason. So no matter where you come from, our teachings speak that we all have a sacred gift to carry. It was given to us to give to the community to fulfill our life purpose, and we all are accountable to our own sacred law of our land where we come from. So, and I think that's great for Western folks too, to go way back there, and on that side of my family, I've done that work too, and gone to the Hebrides in Scotland and seen what the land-based law is there. It's really interesting, and a way of integrating my identity as a mixed blood woman, but also recognizing that we've all come through great fires, in our heritage. And I think it's really important to unpack that stuff for ourselves, but also in the spirit of allyship, when we're working with Indigenous folks, to not center that as non-Indigenous folks. That's really an important part of the allyship work. As an older, fair-skinned person, I have to acknowledge my place in that system and not be taking up too much space or platform away from the folks that are doing this work too in community, right? So acknowledging our place. So, because when we do this trauma work, we do trauma workshops with Indigenous folks, non-Indigenous folks. We'll hear a lot of the non-Indigenous folks say, well, we were really oppressed too, and you were, yes, but we cannot center that in this work, we cannot. We have to get out of the way. We have to acknowledge that, yes, although those fires happen for our people, we have great privilege in our communities and societies now, and we walk through the world in a totally different way, and I see it, I go to healthcare, I smiles, and I take a young person, the stories I hear is not smiles, and as soon as I hand the status card, it's a different story sometimes, right? But so reclaiming that interconnected worldview, our sacred law, but acknowledging our place in that sacred law. So we have to acknowledge the systems that are still in place and still offer us certain privileges, and then, which connects to the third point of self-determination of one's own future. So giving space for young people to realize their gifts and bring them out, and acknowledging people for their gifts and their lived experience, and really being compassionate, to those folks that really challenge you. Wow, you must have been through a lot of stuff, and I'm going to be really compassionate and hold space, and not let my triggers come in the way of that relationship. So that self-determination piece, I think, is really important in the work that we do in community. So allowing space for that to happen. This is a table, just a little picture of our last workshop. We had a curriculum developed by Dr. Cynthia Sturbees with the youth called Decolonizing 101, and it's available for Indigenous youth and non-Indigenous youth. But what they are doing is they say, okay, well, we're going to set up an altar, and you're going to bring your sacred items to put on here as your intentional piece in this work. And we had items from all over the world, and it was really cool to see these young people. We had all Indigenous people mostly in this workshop, but in other workshops we've seen, people bring their items and just really set that intention and hold that space. And this is also the work of Indigenize, so doing an invocation and calling in that spirit of cultural resurgence, of connecting back to land and connecting to our sacred law has been a really powerful tool that I've seen in this work. So yeah, I just wanted to show that picture because I always look at it for inspiration. And to see this young people connect back to spirit. And so the last slide I have, this is of a youth that I worked with for many years. She's now a young adult, and she's given me permission to share a little bit of her story. Her name is Rhonda, and this is her collecting medicine with a former youth worker, Aegis O'Brien, who's an expert cedar weaver. She's Kwakwaka'wakw in Haida. And she was making medicine salves with these young people. But, I look at Rhonda as a symbol of the way that this work can be transformative, and the way that I really have hope for the next 7 generations because of young people like her. She was in the system out in Alberta and is part of a class action lawsuit right now because of what happened to her, and I couldn't imagine, I couldn't imagine going through that and then coming out the other side. And then she had children taken away from her because of risk of homelessness. So we see how these systems can still really cause harm and are continuing the cycle. So looking at the policy, the systems, and how we can advocate to change those things so we don't see that happening. And now she's thriving. She just did a presentation to a lot of different BC ministers about changing policy for children in care, and she did a lot of work connecting back to culture. And she's got 2 beautiful babies, and I just want to say a little prayer for them, because this is for me an example of our young people working through that pain and raising their babies in a really good way, and it gives me hope for the next 7 generations. So just to end off on that, so I just want to hold my hands up to all the folks out there that do that work, supporting our young people, looking at the systems, trying to dismantle the systems that cause harm, and then reinstating our cultural ways to raise our children and bring up those babies so we can stop that transmission and give them a good life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be that long.
I loved all that you shared, and the looking at it from the self and moving out, and all those pieces, because they're all, you can't look at one without the other.
Yeah,
they're all connected.
Definitely.
And how important it is to have that experiential pieces, the art-based pieces, the land-based pieces, how we can reconnect with the land and our spirit and our families, and finding families, if youth have grown up away from their families and communities, how they can find family that may not be family, that blood family. So we'll open it up for some questions and discussion now, and there's a few comments here that I'll read out to you.
Awesome.
As you were presenting. So great job, Jeska. Cindy at UNBC in Prince George here. We'll definitely come back and check for this again on YouTube.
Awesome.
Andrea here, you're speaking my language, love all the material you're referencing, a lot of which I've also used. Miigwech for all this good work.
If you have any other material, send it over.
Yeah.
I love connecting with other scholars and sharing, those real nuggets.
Yes. And it's awesome, and thanks so much, Jeska, for sharing.
Awesome.
So any other comments or questions for Jeska before we close off for the day?
And just one more piece I wanted to add was Indigenize that brought me here. I really love the creative stuff. They call it connecting to their creative self, and like what you were saying with the experiential art stuff. And I think it's so important because in our worldview we were created by Creator, and that we all have a piece of that in us, right? So when we can foster programs that have creativity woven in them, you can see that connection happen no matter where youth have been from, no matter where families have been from. I've seen it with men, women, children, and elders. If they can like just sit there and be creative, it's like a real good vehicle to like have some of these conversations and do some of the work.
That's been a journey for myself over the last 6 years, engaging with art and creativity and how healing it is.
And setting aside the time, right? Like, I am not the best person at setting aside the time, but I advocate for it.
How I get into that present moment. Like, no past, no future, just present.
Totally.
Stillness.
And how it's like, a lot of the time it's not us either. It feels like something coming through us. As a way of like, I feel like connecting to our purpose.
I don't know when I start what's going to come out.
Totally. Oh, it's so cool.
Way to rock, Jeska.
Right on.
I thank you for sharing your good work. You've inspired my work here in Nanaimo. I'll raise my hands to you, darling. I look forward to tomorrow. And amazing. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much. It was very reinvigorating.
Very cool. That's awesome.
Do you have any potential funding sources for community art projects? I am in Alberta.
Ooh, Alberta. Okay, so there is the Canada Council of the Arts has some Indigenous focused art funding. There's a couple different foundations out there too, actually. The Circle just brought a bunch of foundations and community workers together, and there's something called the Calgary Foundation, and I think there's a couple more out there too, but they will sponsor community projects like that. And then there's something here in Vancouver too called the Grant Database. You can only access it at one library, but I would ask your library if you have access to a grant database. They're usually a couple $100, right, to access, but sometimes your libraries will have them. And then you just punch in your what you want to do and where you're at, and it'll come up with a bunch of different options.
Sometimes a local arts organization too might.
Yes, definitely.
So much appreciated, and thank you for sharing this value.
Awesome. Yeah, and then there's more resources on our website. So Indigenize has a website, indigenize.ca, and I have a website, youngartistwarriors.com. And there's a bunch of different resources, and we have stuff for teachers and stuff for community leaders, and
Great.
And if anybody knows of any young people that are interested in being facilitators, we have a number of programs for that too, with both Indigenize and my work at Frafka, a social enterprise, to hire Indigenous young facilitators, and it's been really cool doing that work because you have to do all the identity stuff to do the work, right? So it's been very transformative for me, and then being able to take young people through the process too has been really cool.
Davina's added the link there for people to Indigenize.
Awesome.
And okay, well, there's no other comments or questions. One more here. Jeska, your knowledge and teachings are grounding. If I could listen to this every morning, I would come to this good space. Maybe you should do a podcast.
Right on, sweet.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you for all the real teachings that you shared today, and how those can relate to the realities of, the hurts that have come into our communities, that are still here in our communities, and how we can build those networks amongst each other, with ourselves, with our colleagues, with our communities and families. And thank you everyone for joining today, and all your good energy that you've brought over the chat box here. I want to thank Davina as well. So some great sessions coming up, and please join us again, and hope everyone has an amazing day.
Awesome. Thank you again. Thank you.